In the waning days of autumn 1942, 1,000,000 tons of shipping was proceeding silently on the Atlantic toward Gibraltar, bearing 107,000 British and American fighting men, some well-trained, others not, for the invasion of North Africa. This was the greatest armada to sail into battle in the history of the world. Yet the enemy did not realize what was about to happen until it became an accomplished fact. The invasion was split into three groups. The Western Task Force sailed from the U.S. bound for Casablanca. The Center and Eastern forces left from the British Isles and headed for Oran and Algiers. Virtually all the American troops aboard the transports were going into action for the first time. Just a few months earlier, these men had been clerks, garage mechanics, business executives, salesmen, lawyers, and factory workers. Now, only a few days away, they must be prepared to face the overwhelming demands of battle for the first time. Most of the men were making the adjustments successfully. When the ships were several days out at sea, the troops were briefed on where they would land and taught basic phrases of the languages spoken there. Instruction in French was supplemented by lessons in elementary Arabic during the long hours of waiting. Infantrymen worked endlessly on preparing their weapons, on which their lives might depend for the day of invasion. En route, they learned more about their assignment.
Soldiers and sailors, it is not known whether the French African army will contest our landing. But all resistance, by whomever offers, must be destroyed. However, when any of the French soldiers seek to surrender, you will accept it and treat them with the respect due a brave opponent and future ally. Remember, the French are not Nazis or Japs.
Our troops had been only hastily trained for this complicated type of landing operation. Available shipping did not permit us to carry along all the forces and equipment necessary to assure success. Of course, we were tense. It was natural.
Behind our first military offensive against the Nazis stood American industrial production, now geared to full wartime output. Under the leadership of Lieutenant General Brehon Somervell, Chief of the Army's Services of Supply, the nation had succeeded, during the years since Pearl Harbor, in converting from a peacetime to a wartime economy. General Somervell's branch of the Army was to play just as vital a part in the winning of the war as any combat unit. Among the millions who helped to do the job General Somervell directed was Dick Billette, a railroad engineer for the past 20 years.
That's the way we used to highball through during the war. Nothing held up priority freight in those days. When the Army said rush, we rushed.
We spent a lot of time in the cab in those days, but we knew that if we slowed up on the job, it meant that the men at the front wouldn't have all the equipment and supplies that they needed. As fast as the stuff rolled off the production lines, we hauled it to the East Coast.
The nation's railroads succeeded in winning the crucial battle of transportation by handling unprecedented quantities of supplies with maximum efficiency. A sizable percentage of American industrial corporations quickly converted to the production of equipment vital to the winning of the war. From the standpoint of production, 1942 was a year of miracles. Most war industries showed great increases in volume output. United in the common cause, the American people in every quarter of the country forgot political and economic differences and worked as they never had before to make our victory on the battlefields possible. During 1942, the war workers of the United States produced 48,000 military planes of all types, more than the total production of planes by Germany, Italy, and Japan combined for that year.
Already, we had learned the lesson that while air power alone might not win a victory, No great victory is possible without air superiority. Consequently, the need for airplanes in vast numbers competed with all needs. Everything from beeswax to battleships that goes to make up a nation's fighting power.
During that year, too, the U.S. produced some 56,000 combat vehicles, such as tanks and self-propelled artillery, key weapons in modern mechanized war.
The American Army has always featured mobility in the organization and equipment of its forces. Our advantage in this direction was vastly increased by the mass production methods of American industry.
Large-scale invasions like the North African campaign had their birth many months before contact with the enemy was made. The success of Operation Torch depended directly on the round-the-clock job of millions of conscientious American war workers who produced the vast quantities of the machinery of war needed before the campaign could even be planned. The roadbeds of every railroad line in the country were in constant use. Freight and flat cars, which in peacetime would have been scrapped and replaced, were pressed into service. To help transport the vital materiel from war plants in all parts of the country, thousands of miles eastward, to the great port cities on the Atlantic seaboard. At the ports of embarkation, cargo ships were loaded with every item necessary to keeping an enormous army in good health, in good spirits, and well equipped for battle on any terrain. Supplies arrived on the East Coast faster than they could be transshipped overseas, and vast stockpiles soon filled warehouses in eastern port cities to overflowing. As the U.S. approached the end of its first year at war, American industry was successfully meeting the tremendous challenge of the battle of supply. The most critical problem in keeping the flow of supplies moving to our troops overseas was the serious shortage of ships. In November of 1942, the tonnage of Allied shipping sunk by enemy action exceeded the tonnage in the construction of new ships. For the invasion of North Africa, scores of cargo ships were loaded day and night at American ports with the machines of war to be used shortly against the enemy. Slowly, our first offensive against the Nazis was gathering momentum. All three task forces involved in the North African invasion, 2 from the British Isles and 1 from the United States, proceeded to the points of attack in complete secrecy. Allied commanders considered it remarkable that the enemy, with all its U-boats, did not detect the presence of 3 massive forces all converging near Gibraltar. Right up to the day of the landings, our tactics were never clearly interpreted by the enemy. Something was in the wind, the Nazis realized, but they had no idea what, until our ships were in position for the assault. The orders called for all 3 task forces to arrive off the points of attack simultaneously. For the troops, H-hour was to be approximately the same in all 3 landings in the early morning of November 8th.
In spite of the inaction imposed on us at Gibraltar, there was work we could do. Already, we were planning steps to follow a successful landing, including the early transfer of headquarters to Algiers. Before the attack, the weather reports from the Casablanca region were gloomy, and I tentatively decided, unless conditions should improve, to divert the expedition into Gibraltar. All our plans would thus be badly upset, but this seemed better than to steam aimlessly around the ocean dodging submarines.
Meanwhile, the Center and Eastern forces had headed for the Strait of Gibraltar.
Finally, the leading ships steamed in at night through the narrow strait, and we stood on the dark headlands to watch them pass. Still, no news of air or submarine attack. We became more hopeful.
The Eastern force, scheduled to land at Algiers, was composed of both British and American ships and carried 33,000 invasion troops, 10,000 American, and the other 23,000 British.
Both governments were convinced that the expedition should be as exclusively American in complexion as it was possible to make it. Obviously, the French African forces and the population would learn soon after the initial landings of British participation. But it was believed that if entry could be gained and our friendly attitude promptly and clearly proved, possible complications would be minimized.
All the warships in the two Mediterranean forces were British. The Center Task Force, with American transports, carried 39,000 American troops who were to land in the Oran area. In the early morning of November 8th, Allied naval units engaged the French. Off Algiers, the Eastern Task Force arrived on schedule, and the troops prepared to go ashore. No one was sure of exactly what the French garrison ashore would do by way of opposing the landing. For 16 hours during the first day, Allied troops poured ashore by the thousands. After feeble resistance by the confused French defenders, who did not understand at first which country's troops were landing, firing ceased on the evening of the first day. The area was quickly occupied by our forces.
The Oran assault involved the U.S. 1st Infantry Division and parts of the U.S. 1st Armored Division.
In addition, 500 American paratroopers were flown from the British Isles and dropped near the airfield south of Oran. By a miscalculation, some were dropped over the wrong area. Unfortunately, the mission was unsuccessful. At Oran, the landings were a different story. For the invasion of Oran, American troops had been decided upon. For the Allied High Command felt that the French, stationed in and near Oran, would bitterly resist the British after the Royal Navy's attack on the French fleet there. The plan called for one combat group to land to the east of the city and another force to the west of Oran. Then both were to converge and capture the city by a double envelopment. After the naval engagement in Oran Harbor, the troops started ashore in the early morning of November 8th. Some 200 miles east, the invasion of Algiers was beginning. And to the west, on the Atlantic coast, the assault at Casablanca was getting started. Although some of the assault waves were delayed in starting ashore, the landings on both flanks of Oran went off smoothly. Some units landed unopposed. Others encountered stiff resistance.
During the course of the night and in the early morning hours of November 8th, operational reports began to come in that were encouraging in tone. At Oran, the U.S. 1st Division, which was later to travel such a long battle road in this war, got its first taste of conflict. In spite of incomplete training, the 1st Division, supported by elements of the 1st Armored Division, made progress, and on November 9th, we knew we would soon be able to report victory in that area. On the 10th, all fighting ceased at Oran.
The final assault, aimed at taking all of Oran, had been scheduled for noon on November 10th. But the surrender of the French at that time ended the fighting, and the city itself was occupied by American forces. The Allies now controlled two of the chief Mediterranean ports in French North Africa. With the surrender, thousands of French troops who had fought conscientiously under the orders of their Vichy-controlled commanders lay down their arms. The second part of the three-pronged invasion of North Africa was successfully accomplished. The third and most difficult landing was scheduled on the Atlantic coast of French Morocco, north and south of Casablanca. The All-American Western Task Force stood offshore late on the evening of November 7th and was fired on early the next morning by elements of the French fleet. The naval battle raged off the coast all that day, with 4 of the French ships finally sunk and the remainder put to rout. Meanwhile, the troops were encountering heavy opposition ashore, notably at Port Lyautey, north of Casablanca. After 4 days of fierce fighting, the French received orders to cease firing.
The minimum objective of the North African invasion was to seize the main ports between Casablanca and Algiers, and from them to operate eastward toward the British desert forces. The successful action of the first few days assured its attainment.
American and British units, which had participated in the 3 landings, now battle-tested, moved forward at once toward the British 8th Army more than 1,200 miles away. In between were the Nazis.
Our concern over these affairs illustrates forcibly the old truism that political considerations can never be wholly separated from military ones, and that war is a mere continuation of political policy in the field of force.
Once Allied troops were safely ashore in North Africa, our commanders wanted to move out to meet the Nazis with all possible speed before they could bring reinforcements across the Mediterranean. But the big problem was not a simple military one. Complicating the forward movement of our troops was the baffling French political situation.
It was useless then, and for many days thereafter, to talk to a Frenchman, civilian or soldier, unless one first recognized Marshal Pétain's overriding influence. His picture appeared prominently in every private dwelling and in public buildings. Any proposal was acceptable only if the Marshal would wish it.
The people were greatly influenced by Marshal Pétain, World War I hero of the Battle of Verdun, and aging premier of the Hitler-dominated Vichy government. But to General Henri Giraud, whom the Allied High Command counted on heavily to swing the North African French over to the Allied cause, they paid little attention.
The cold reception by the French in Africa of General Giraud was a terrific blow to our expectations. He was completely ignored.
In every case, after the successful landings had been made, Allied commanders tried to negotiate with French military leaders for a permanent peace agreement.
We had our written orders from our governments to cooperate with any French government we should find existing at the moment of our entry into Africa. Moreover, the matter at the moment was completely military. I might be fired, but only by making a quick decision could the essential unity of effort throughout both nations be preserved and the immediate military requirements met. We discussed these possibilities very soberly and earnestly, always remembering that our basic orders required us to go into Africa in the attempt to win an ally, not to kill Frenchmen. I flew to Algiers on November 13th with Admiral Cunningham and went into conference with General Clark and Mr. Robert Murphy, the American Consul General in the area.
But center of attention was Vichyite Jean Delin, the key to a possible solution to our North African problem.
I well knew that any dealing with a Vichyite would create great revulsion among those in England and America who did not know the harsh realities of war. Therefore, I determined to confine my judgment in the matter to the local military aspects. In Darlan, we had the commander-in-chief of the French fighting forces.
Meanwhile, General Eisenhower's forces had already started their drive to the east to meet the British Desert Army, 1,200 miles away at the other end of North Africa. The plan was to catch the German Afrika Korps in a giant vice and then crush it from both sides.
Between us, we would destroy all Axis forces in northern Africa. Every advance by the Allies from either flank would tend to squeeze the Axis channel of supplies, and with continuation of this process, eventual strangulation would result. All during late November and early December, the piecemeal process of reinforcing our eastern lines, principally by American troops, went on. If we should fail to take Tunis, we would suffer severely, and General Sir Kenneth Anderson was given positive orders to use everything possible to gain his objective. had a crying need for forward airfields. The air power of the Axis in Sicily, Pantelleria, and southern Italy was still so strong as to preclude the possibility of Allied naval advance into that region. Final success in cutting the Axis communications would demand land advance with continuous buildup of forward air bases and air power. To perform this seeming miracle of construction, the engineers employed almost every type of modern earth-moving machinery to be found on any large construction job in the United States.
Hastily from across the Mediterranean, the Nazis were bringing reinforcements to Tunis to strengthen the German armies under the overall command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring in preparation for the showdown battle for Tunis, which was then forming. The success of the Allied military offensive depended to a considerable extent on whether an agreement was reached with Darlan and the French political muddle resolved. If not, the Allies faced a possible open break with the North African French military forces, which consisted of some 200,000 French and colonial troops.
It was squarely up to me to decide whether or not the procurement of an armistice and the saving of time and lives were worth more to the Allied forces than the arbitrary arrest of Darlan, an action certain to be accompanied by continued fighting and cumulative bitterness.
The French Air Force in North Africa had a strength of several hundred planes, which could quickly go into action against us if no agreement were reached, and greatly retard our drive eastward toward the Nazis.
It was our intention to win North Africa only for use as a base from which to carry on the war against Hitler.
When the Allies finally settled with Darlan, correspondents in Algiers were confronted with the problem of trying to explain the puzzling situation and still obey military security.
I guess you can't blame the people back home. Mike must understand why they react so strongly to a guy at Vichy written all over him.
The delicate pattern of our relations with Darlan was carefully described to the American people.
The press is primarily and properly concerned with providing information to the public at home. Civilians are entitled to know everything about the war that need not remain secret. Indeed, the commander in the field must never forget that it is his duty to cooperate in the task of maintaining a civilian morale that will be equal to every purpose.
But to many Americans, the news from North Africa was confusing and irritating.
Why do we have to do business with a collaborationist like Darlan?
I don't like the looks of it. Who are we fighting in this war, anyway?
But the union with Darlan in North Africa achieved for the Allies a permanent peace with the French there.
Too bad the people back home don't realize that a lot of GIs might have been knocked off if it hadn't been for Ike's last-minute deal with Darlan.
In the Allied forward area on Christmas Day 1942, General Eisenhower had dinner on a road as he returned from Souk al-Khamis, British 5th Corps headquarters. His visit had a heartening effect.
Soldiers like to see the men who are directing operations. They invariably interpret a visit, even a brief one, as evidence of their commander's concern. Diffidence or modesty must never blind the commander to his duty of showing himself to his men. It pays big dividends in terms of morale. The soldier has a sense of gratification whenever he sees high rank in his particular vicinity, possibly on the theory that the area is a safe one, or the rank wouldn't be there.
That same day, General Eisenhower headed back to Algiers for the funeral of Admiral Darlan, who had been assassinated the evening before by a French youth.
Notice of his death reached me near Bajaz. I immediately started for Algiers and arrived there after 30 hours of non-stop driving. My entire acquaintanceship with Darlan covered a period of 6 weeks. His reputation was that of a notorious collaborator with Hitler. But during the time that he served as administrator of French North Africa, he never once, to our knowledge, violated any commitment or promise. On the other hand, his mannerisms and personality did not inspire confidence. And in view of his reputation, we were always uneasy in dealing with him. In any event, his death presented me with new problems. While it was known, of course, that the person in the French government I trusted most was General Giraud, my headquarters was still in no position to sponsor a puppet government. Moreover, in our inner councils, we doubted Giraud's ability to establish himself firmly in the chief position. But no one else was both acceptable and immediately available. Without delay, the French local officials named General Giraud as the temporary administrator of North Africa to succeed Darlan.
But complicated as the political situation in French North Africa remained, at least the French military forces were no longer fighting against us. French troops were now allied with British and American units. In the African theater, French soldiers saw considerable action, fighting now on our side. In a bold attempt to try to reach Tunis before the Nazis could further reinforce their position there, the British First Army continued its punishing drive without let-up.
600!
Troops and commanders were not experienced, but the boldness, courage, and stamina of General Anderson's forces could not have been exceeded by the most battle-wise veterans. The bringing up of supplies and ammunition was a Herculean task. In spite of all this, and in spite of Anderson's lack of strength, his whole force numbered only about 3 brigades of infantry, he pushed on and finally reached a point not far from the outskirts of Tunis. Very early, I had determined to take whatever additional risks might be involved in weakening our rear in order to strengthen Anderson. I was quite willing to take all later criticism if only the Allied forces could turn over Tunis to our people as a New Year's present. But in early December, the enemy was strong enough in mechanized units to begin local but sharp counterattacks, and we were forced back from our most forward positions in front of Tunis. I directed that the attack be indefinitely postponed. It is always necessary for the commander to avoid an attitude of defeatism. But on that occasion, it was exceedingly difficult to display any particular optimism. Immediately the decision was reached, we were faced with the problem of straightening out our lines, assembling units into proper formations, and protecting our flank. The rain fell constantly. Physical conditions were almost unendurable. Winter cold was already descending upon the Tunisian highlands. The Christmas season brought to me the dismaying realization that there are certain limits of physical stamina that cannot safely be exceeded. I inherited a hearty constitution from sturdy forebears, and heretofore always careful of health requisites, I had come to believe myself immune from the fatigues and exhaustions that I frequently observed in others. But as the December weeks kept me constantly on the road, I definitely felt a deterioration in vigor. But I learned a lesson I did not thereafter violate. A full measure of health is basic to successful command. I did not have another sick day during the war. Since none of the scattered airstrips that we had hoped to use boasted of a paved runway, our small air forces were handicapped, and for days at a stretch were rendered almost completely helpless. The enemy was far better situated, since his large fields at Bizerta and Tunis were suitable for operations in all kinds of weather.
The Allied offensive was stalled until the weather broke. For the troops, already exhausted by the weeks of bitter fighting since the invasion began, the rest was welcome, but not exactly pleasant. Every day, they seemed to sink still further into the mud.
Morale of the combat troops had always to be carefully watched. The capacity of soldiers for absorbing punishment and enduring privations is almost inexhaustible so long as they believe they are getting a square deal, that their commanders are looking out for them, and that their own accomplishments are understood and appreciated. Any intimation that they are the victims of unfair treatment understandably arouses their anger and resentment.
In the midst of the gloom at the front in January of 1943 came the electrifying news that President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill were meeting at Casablanca. Greatly elated by the occasion were the troops in the vicinity, as well as the high commanders of the Allied armies and navies. The President's concern with the serious war problems still facing the Allies was offset by the obvious thrill he experienced from the visit. Some of the units then in the area enthusiastically filed past the President's reviewing post in an atmosphere charged with excitement. A few surprised GIs who had already distinguished themselves in the battle for North Africa during the few weeks just past had the happy honor of being decorated personally by their commander-in-chief.
His optimism and buoyancy, amounting almost to lightheartedness, I attributed to the atmosphere of adventure attached to the Casablanca expedition. Successful in shaking loose for a few days many of the burdens of state, he seemed to experience a tremendous uplift from the fact that he had secretly slipped away from Washington and was engaged in a historic meeting on territory that only 2 months before had been a battleground. He speculated at length on the possibility of France's regaining her ancient position of prestige and power in Europe, and on this point was very pessimistic.
Another notable meeting brought de Gaulle and Giraud together.
The local antagonism in the French army and in the government against de Gaulle had been intense, but he enjoyed a distinct popularity with the civilians. The de Gaulle forces had attacked every French official in Africa. By imposing political censorship on all, I prevented local French officials from participating in the public quarrel. It was lifted the second I learned that Giraud and de Gaulle had agreed to meet at Casablanca. The President was hopeful of a quick settlement of the situation through a reconciliation between Giraud and de Gaulle, feeling that he could convince both that the best interests of France would be served by their joining forces.
At the conference, the meeting of the combined chiefs of staff proclaimed in ringing terms our policy for the pursuit of the war against the Axis. A number of specific military policy matters were also settled.
Of immediate importance to me was the decision that the British Eighth Army and the Desert Air Force, coming up through Tripoli and Lower Tunisia, would be assigned to the Allied forces under my command when once they had entered the latter province. This development was extraordinarily pleasing to me because it meant, first and foremost, complete unity of action in the central Mediterranean. It was some time after I had returned to Algiers that the unconditional surrender formula was announced at Casablanca.
Generals Eisenhower and Alexander were to work together closely throughout the decisive final phase of the North African campaign.
I quickly formed a great respect and admiration for his soldierly qualities, an esteem that continued to grow throughout the remainder of the war.
For 6 weeks, the Allied advance had been stalled in the heavy mud. Reinforcements were brought up, and our battle line organized in preparation for the planned assault designed to bottle the Nazis up in Tunisia. The enemy, too, was preparing for the showdown battle. Some of the forces under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, were reassigned to the north to bolster the positions of Von Arnim there. Meantime, Rommel was fighting a strong delaying action against the British Eighth Army. Forcing Rommel's Afrika Korps to retreat steadily were General Sir Bernard Montgomery's forces.
Montgomery's outstanding characteristic was his tactical ability in the prepared battle. He is careful, meticulous, and certain.
On the other side, the Nazis were being pressed back by the Allied forces which had made the landings in French North Africa 3 months earlier. In the winter of 1943, Generals Alexander and Anderson completed discussions of the details for the beginning of our new all-out drive toward Tunis in a final thrust to wipe the enemy off the African continent.
In early February, we received information that the enemy was preparing a counterattack against our lines through the pass at Fonduque, expected to be more ambitious than any he had yet attempted.
The Allied intelligence about a heavy enemy attack was accurate. The Nazi forces massed their mechanized equipment, which led the advance, supported by infantry units. The last frantic German drive to keep all of North Africa from falling to the Allies was on. The Germans attacked in force, but not at the point where the Allies expected it. At Faid and at Gaza, the enemy launched a heavy two-pronged assault, with both forces converging at Kasserine, at the base of the now famous Kasserine Pass. The Allies were caught flat-footed.
During the withdrawal, the Americans fought a series of ineffective, though gallant, delaying actions on the way back toward Kasserine Pass. Several, including myself, shared responsibility for our week of reverses. Technically, our embarrassment resulted from four principal causes. The first, and vastly most important of these, was the inescapable conditions resulting from failure in our long-shot gamble to capture Tunis quickly. The second was faulty work by intelligence agencies. The third was the failure to comprehend clearly the capabilities of the enemy and the best measures for meeting them. The fourth was greenness.
The battle at Kasserine Pass was one of the worst setbacks the Allies had suffered so far.
As a result of the Kasserine battle, the entire American Second Corps of 4 divisions was finally concentrated in the Tebessa region. From the close of the Kasserine battle, our position steadily improved. The stage was now set for the final all-out effort against the enemy position. Moreover, as a result of splendid action in Washington, an extra shipment of 5,400 trucks had been brought into the theater. This shipment immeasurably improved our transport and supply situation and had a profound effect in all later operations. Another particularly pleasing development was the steadily growing strength and efficiency of our air forces and the construction of suitable operating fields and bases.
As the final drive started, Allied superiority in the air was growing steadily. The enemy was driven to cover. The big push was on.
Just after the 1st of March, I made Patton commander of the Second Corps. For such a job, he had no superior in the Army. His buoyant leadership and strict insistence on discipline rapidly rejuvenated the Second Corps and brought it up to fighting pitch. Moreover, the troops were now fortified by battle experience and had a much higher appreciation of the value of training, discipline, and speed in action. The first move was to launch assaults calculated to drive the enemy back to the edge of the Tunisian plain. These began on April 23rd, and all along the line, satisfactory advances were made. The enemy's positions were exceedingly strong naturally, and fiercely defended, and were essential to us in our final drive for victory.
The Germans were putting up a stubborn fight, but the American Second Corps and the British First Army proved too much for them. The battle for Tunis was entering its final phase. The enemy was thoroughly beaten, but continued to try to stop our rapid advance toward Tunis and complete victory, now virtually within our grasp.
Meanwhile, the British Eighth Army under General Montgomery was able to continue its advance to the westward with the purpose of making junction with the right of our forces in Tunisia. It was foreseen that General Montgomery's principal battle to achieve this result would take place on the Mareth Line, a defensive position along the Tunisian border in which we now expected the Axis to make a determined defense. By the night of March 20th, General Montgomery was ready to attack the Mareth Line.
The British Tommies had the Nazis' Desert Fox almost at bay. Montgomery's men were eager for the kill. For 5 months, the army of the crafty Rommel had been under attack by the British Eighth Army, which had zigzagged across North Africa. Now, after El Alamein, Tobruk, Benghazi, and Tripoli, the enemy was finally ground down by the wiry Eighth Army Tommies.
Fire!
The Afrika Corps did not give up easily. For 9 days, the Nazis fought back doggedly before the Battle of Mareth became another notable Allied victory.
The fighting was severe, but by a brilliant and rapid switch of forces in the midst of the battle, Montgomery succeeded in outflanking and surprising the enemy and drove him precipitately to the northward.
On through Tunisia, the Allies rolled toward final triumph in Africa. It had been a tough, bloody campaign, and the taste of victory was sweet to the men who had fought for so long to achieve it. After 5 months of the most bitter fighting, early in April, the Americans of the Second Corps met the Tommies of Montgomery's Eighth Army. Once separated by 1,200 miles, the American Second Corps and the British Eighth Army now faced the Nazis as a single, overpowering fighting force.
At last, all our troops were connected up in one single battle line.
On each side, the troops and the commanders had looked forward to this happy meeting for many discouraging months. This was a day to be remembered. But final victory was not yet ours. The enemy was still entrenched in positions on the hill to the north and had to be gradually routed out. The job at Hill 609 fell to the Americans of the Second Corps.
609 was captured by the 34th Division to the intense satisfaction, particularly of the American High Command. This division had been denied opportunity for training to a greater degree than any other, and its capture of the formidable 609 was final proof that the American ground forces had come fully of age. From then on, the operations were of a mopping-up variety. The Tunisian victory was hailed with delight throughout the Allied nations. It clearly signified to friend and foe alike that the Allies were at last upon the march. The important Allied lesson of Tunisia on the technical side was the value of training. Thorough technical, psychological, and physical training is one protection and one weapon that every nation can give to its soldiers before committing them to battle. Until world order is an accomplished fact and universal disarmament a logical result, it will always be a crime to excuse men from the types and kinds of training that will give them a decent chance for survival in battle.
The liberation of the Tunisian towns followed the same pattern that was to be repeated over and over in the campaigns on the European continent. Patrols were still seeking out enemy soldiers among the ruins.
Some fighting continued until the 12th of May. But by the following day, except for a few stragglers, the only living Germans left in Tunisia were safely in our hands. The number of prisoners during the last week of the campaign alone reached 240,000, of which approximately 125,000 were German. Included in these captures was all that was left of the Afrika Korps and a number of other cracked German and Italian units.
The German soldier in defeat presented quite a different appearance than the German soldier in victory. In World War II, the Nazi High Command early instilled an arrogance that was usually missing after their capture. Misled by the Führer's assurances that the Wehrmacht was invincible, many of the captured Nazi soldiers seemed sadly disillusioned. Their dream of world conquest that had grown to enormous proportions since September 1939 was suddenly over. Stripped of the mantle of conqueror, the Nazi soldier was ill-prepared psychologically for the role of the vanquished. These were the supermen, the elite of the master race. Their path of victory, begun so triumphantly in Berlin nearly 4 years earlier, had come to a sorry end in Tunis. Beaten and bedraggled, they wore the face of every people who have tried to conquer the world and impose their will on others. The Nazi world conquerors ended up like all the rest. Caught in the giant Allied squeeze, the Nazis were wiped right off the African continent. The victory was officially ours on May 13th, 1943, and the once feared Afrika Korps no longer existed.